All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this breakout session titled Youth Labor Bridging in the Context of Shocks. If you're coming from the main session, I hope you enjoyed it, and be rest assured that, this is also going to be a very informative session as well. My name is Temi Alabi, and I am the room facilitator for this session. So before I introduce you to the moderator, I would just like to remind everyone that please mute yourself if you are not presenting, most especially if you're joining us from a phone. I know sometimes, people forget. So please just remember to stay muted. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Megan Maney. Megan?
Thanks, Tammy. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Megan Minen. I'm the Youth Workforce Development Advisor in the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID, based in Washington, D.C. And I'm really glad to be here with you today to talk about labor bridging in the context of shocks. I know time is quite the disorienting construct these days with many of us at home, and so much has happened just in the past few days, but I'll ask you all to travel back with me in your minds to a few years ago to 2016, when USAID increased investments in Central America in an effort to better assist a region that was dealing with shock after shock, underpinned by record levels of violence and slow economic growth, which are among the principal drivers of irregular migration. One area in which USAID invested heavily at that time and continues to invest in today in order to address both the security and the economic challenges countries in that region face is youth workforce development. And so in Central America, which for USAID focuses on Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, 6 different youth workforce development programs designed to serve at-risk and disadvantaged populations specifically began within roughly a year of each other. And my team here in the LAC Bureau at USAID Washington saw this as an opportunity to work together with our partner Mathmatica to form the Youth Workforce Development in Central America Community of Practice in order to aggregate data across projects and, even more importantly, to share experiences, challenges, and lessons learned among the projects, including several different USAID missions and several different implementing partners. And so as you can see here on slide 2, Mathmatica facilitated this learning agenda through annual reporting for 3 years across all 6 projects, annual workshops, and quarterly meetings. And then if we want to move to the next slide, these projects have done just phenomenal work in a region that's context is basically defined by shocks, from violence to droughts and natural disasters to political shocks and, of course, to COVID. These shocks impact programs in myriad ways, but perhaps precisely when a youth finishes their training and is actually looking for a job is when they're most vulnerable to shocks. And today we're going to speak to the chiefs of party of 3 of the 6 programs, as well as to Mathmatica, to share more about their specific experiences with labor bridging in the context of shocks. And when we say labor bridging, we just mean supporting youth in the transition from training to employment, including self-employment. So if you want to move to the next slide, we can see the names of the people we're so lucky to have with us today. We have Sarah Siwulka from World Vision. She's the chief of party of the Puentes project in Guatemala. We have Lindsay Jaco from Banyan Global, who's the chief of party of the Abrando Futuros project in Honduras. We have Caterina Valero from DAI, who's the chief of party of the Bridges to Employment program in El Salvador. And we have Patricia Costa, who's a senior researcher at Mathmatica. And I'm going to pass it over to them in just a minute because they're the people we're here to listen to. But first, if you want to move to the next slide, Tammy, we also want to make sure that this is as much of an interactive dialogue as possible, of course, being done virtually. And we want to hear from you about your experiences as well, because we know that you all have valuable experiences in this area. So of course, as Tammy already mentioned, please type any questions throughout the presentations in the chat. We will get to those at the end. We want to leave time for that, of course. And in addition, we also want to pose to you, to the group, a question. And the question is, in your experience, what are some of the major challenges in helping youth find jobs? We're going to use Mentimeter to monitor your responses, and you'll see the link and the code on the PowerPoint. It's very fast. Go to the link, enter in the code. We'll also drop that into the chat. So please think about that, and please do send in some of your answers and thoughts to that question so that we can have a conversation about some of our shared challenges and approaches to those challenges at the end of the panel. Okay, so now without further ado, I want to pass it to Sarah from the Puentes project in Guatemala to get us started. And just for a little context, Puentes was, I think, the last of the 6 projects to get started that I referenced in the beginning. So it's just over its midpoint of implementation, and it still has just over 2 years of implementing left. So Sarah, over to you, please.
I couldn't figure out how to activate my microphone when I was sharing, but I think we're there now. Okay, great. Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. I am going to be presenting today on a particular tool that we have used in the Puentes project. And I was supposed to activate my camera, and now I think we'll just have to do it without the camera, sorry. I'm going to start out by sharing a little bit of background on the Puentes project. We work in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, aiming to provide 25,000 youth with an opportunity to improve their lives. The entry point for our program is a soft skills or life skills curriculum, which culminates in youth designing or updating their life plan based on what they, the goals that they set in their life plan. We support them either to continue their education, and this can be primary, alternative primary and secondary school education, technical or vocational training, agricultural training, or activities related to STEAM or STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. For those who are ready, we support them with job placement or to start a small business. We also have a number of complementary activities that provide additional support to youth, which you can see listed on the bridge. I don't have time to go into those in detail in this presentation. The particular challenge that we faced that I wanted to talk about today has to do with tailoring our approach to provide personalized support to youth to build their resilience to shocks and adversity. In the region where we work, let's see, now I can start my video. Okay. In the region where we work, shocks can be anything from economic shocks, natural disasters such as floods and earthquakes, and of course, in the last few months, we've been dealing with the effects of the pandemic, as the rest of the world has. One of the dynamics that we contend with in the region is that these factors contribute to undocumented migration. One step toward building resilience that we have found is providing personalized support through vocational orientation. And now, why would this be? So we believe that helping youth to focus their income generation efforts in areas that are congruent with their interests and their talents is a foundational aspect of promoting resilience. And I would like to introduce to you the tool that we have been using. The 9FP stands for 9 personality factors. It's a psychometric test that was developed in Latin America and validated in various parts of the region. It was introduced to Puentes by one of our private sector partners, actually, that has been using it for a number of years. And they found that it has helped reduce their retention rates and helps with job satisfaction. It also helps them identify areas of growth for their employees. In Puentes so far, we've administered the test to about 1,500 youth, and we find that it gives us valuable insights regarding their characteristics, their innate preferences, and it helps us orient them better in their career choices. To illustrate how this has helped our youth, we have a short video that we would like to share, the story of one of our participants, Gilberto Mendoza. So I'm going to hand over to Temi to show the video.
Muy buena tarde para todos, mi nombre es Gilberto Mendoza Núñez. Actualmente tengo 24 años y soy originario de la aldea de la estancia Aguatango y Utenango. Tuve una oportunidad en trabajar en una institución en la cual pues no me sentía cómodo. Entonces empecé a cranear, analizar realmente en qué soy bueno. Me acudí a Proyecto Puentes, pues gracias a ellos me apoyaron. Apliqué una herramienta que se llama la nueva FP. Es ahí donde puedo descubrir que realmente soy bueno en emprender. Obtuve el 60% como ser emprendedor y se me explicó las cualidades. Me gusta la libertad, me gusta compartir de lo que yo sé. Siempre he estado apoyando a mis vecinos. Actualmente estoy liderando a un grupo de jóvenes que se llama Emprendedores Stand-Ups La Estancia, la cual nos encargamos de producir ajo, cebolla, tomate, una variedad de productos, y siempre hemos creado estrategias como para comercializar. En cuanto al tema de COVID, pues siempre nos afectó un poco, pero por lo mismo, la creatividad, las estrategias nos ayudó bastante. Por ahora hemos logrado superado lo que es la crisis, pues hemos podido sobresalir y descubrir en qué somos buenos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Temi. This is one of many stories that we could share. In this case, the test pointed him towards the entrepreneurship route and validated his interests. We've also used the tool with many youth who are on the job placement track. One thing that struck me about his story, related to what I mentioned earlier, was how he was able to use his strengths, such as his creativity, to adapt to the negative effects of the pandemic on his business. So this is one way that we believe we are contributing to resilience of youth, but it turns out that this tool can actually do more. The developers of the tool created a proxy measure of resilience with items from the test that are drawn from the literature, focusing on the following 10 traits. So we have adaptability, self-esteem, behavioral flexibility, autonomy or independence, creativity, initiative, optimism, critical judgment, cheerfulness, which I think is the best way to translate the Spanish word alegre, and humor. We have recently begun a small pilot with 54 youth from our program to explore this. And here is what we have found. The blue bars show the traits that scored medium to high, and these include adaptability, self-esteem, behavioral flexibility, creativity, and initiative. The traits that scored low among our sample were autonomy and independence, optimism, cheerfulness, humor, and critical judgment is another one that shows room for improvement. In addition to looking at the breakdown of traits within our sample, we also looked at the overall resilience score in different populations. For example, we found that women had higher resilience scores than men, and I think this is consistent with the literature. Indigenous populations had lower resilience scores than the non-Indigenous populations. Urban youth scored lower also than rural populations. And interestingly, youth who are completing elementary school scored higher than those, for example, who are in university. We're not entirely sure what to make of all these findings, and I mentioned that the sample is quite small, so we can't draw necessarily a lot of conclusions, but the findings do give us some interesting food for thought, as well as trends that we could explore with a bigger, more representative sample. Also, the researchers helped us by comparing our results of the small sample of 54 with a much larger representative sample from their database of youth from the Western Highlands. And it actually shows that there are some similar patterns in the distribution of the traits, especially in the traits that have the lowest scores and the highest scores. So that's quite encouraging. Now, what are we doing with this information? I think we have an interesting, some new and interesting challenges and implications for our program. Clearly, we've identified some areas, some resilience traits that have room for improvement in our target population. When I think about independence and autonomy, I can kind of visualize some things that we could integrate into our activities that could help strengthen these areas. But when I think about something like optimism or cheerfulness or humor, for me, those are, I tend to think of these as innate characteristics that you're kind of either born with or not. But it turns out that there actually are things that you can do to develop these things, these traits. The researchers, the developers of the tool did warn us that, they're not going to take you from 0 to 100, but can take what you have and build on that. So what are some of the things that can be done? Well, there are activities that can help strengthen or build neural pathways related to these traits. And a couple of examples that we've discussed that I'll share. One is you could give youth a story to read and ask them to identify the humorous aspects in the stories. And if you do this on a regular basis, it becomes part of a routine. That is where you start working on those neural pathways. And there's something else that I have been hearing a lot about in the last few months. Perhaps you have too. I've heard it from a number of different sources, including well-known academic journals, and that is the importance of gratitude journaling. You list 3 things you're grateful for when you wake up in the morning, 3 things in the evening before you go to bed. And there's a lot of research to show that this simple practice actually has profound results on stress levels, on how you view life. So it can help with optimism. It can affect your physical health, relationships, and other things like that. So we plan to introduce these 2 activities, which I described, and others, and look at their effects with our population. We're very excited about this. We also have further research questions that have come up as we have been exploring this tool. For example, what resilience traits do young entrepreneurs and job seekers or youth who have recently started a job, what traits do they have that have helped them adapt well to the effects of the pandemic versus those that have struggled? Another question relates to internships. Is there a relationship between these resilience traits and openness to internships? We have found internships to be a very helpful approach with youth who have little work experience, which is the case for most of the youth that participate in our program. And a lot of them are resistant to internships, so we would like to explore this further. These are just a couple of the questions that have come up as we've been discussing this. So I think we have our work cut out for us, and we look forward to sharing the results maybe at the next GYEO conference. So that is what I wanted to present today. I've listed my email address here if anybody's interested in following up. And I also want to give a special thanks to some of my team members who've supported with this presentation: Mario Moreno, Marisa Largueta, Juan Mendoza, and our colleagues at Avanza who developed the 9FP, Saul and Sonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really interesting presentation. All of us that work in workforce development understand the need for programming skills, both soft and technical skills in youth. And I think this example of adapting a current tool or looking into a different part of it to help build resilience in youth, which is a skill so important for being able to overcome shocks, is extremely useful. So thank you so much for sharing. Now we're going to turn to Lindsay, and she's going to speak about how her program in Honduras made adjustments to labor bridging activities in response to the current COVID crisis in particular. And again, for context, Empleando Futuros, the program Lindsay will speak about, is nearing the end of implementation. So I think that that impacts how you can adjust to a shock. And the program has about 9 months left. So now I will pass it over to Lindsay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Jaco, and I'm the Chief of Party, as Megan has mentioned, of the Employing Futures Project, or better known as Empleando Futuros in Spanish. As we can see on the next slide, Empleando Futuros is a workforce development project and is spanning from 2016 to 2021. And we focus on increasing employment or return to school opportunities, as well as increasing protective factors for at-risk youth in the 7 highest crime, highest migration municipalities. And our target population ranges from 16 to 30 years old, and they are not working nor are they studying. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the project's focus on both the supply and the demand side of workforce. And this is being represented in the case study that you can see on the next slide. Focusing on both the supply and the demand side of workforce has allowed us to pivot effectively during this COVID pandemic shock. And it has resulted in flexible and adaptable strategies to provide youth with support in finding employment or returning to school. As we move to the next slide, and before diving in, I'd like to share just some details regarding the current employment context in Honduras. So prior to COVID, youth were already confronted with ongoing political violence and economic shocks. They faced an unbalanced job market that wasn't generating enough jobs annually to absorb the 169,000 youth entering every year. Unemployment in those working ages hovered around 8 to 12%, and underemployment was significantly higher at 66%. And most of that underemployment was falling in the invisible category. All of this was on the backdrop of an extremely high dropout rate from primary to secondary education that was last evaluated at a 70%. So moving into the COVID shock, we already had the challenges that we were trying to confront. So as COVID set in, unemployment and underemployment has been exacerbated with an additional estimated 600,000 jobs lost across the nation. And the industries most heavily affected have been in manufacturing, in retail, in construction, in tourism and services. And unfortunately, these are the industries that most often are employing entry-level positions. And that are that first step for our youth in their job search. Of course, the COVID pandemic has also increased competition for jobs. There's fewer jobs, and businesses are looking for individuals with additional skill sets that can provide their services from a remote location, that have access to computers. Unfortunately, this is not the case for our youth. And so this increased competition does provide an additional level of complexity in our employment project. And there is a lack of access to public transportation. We know that our youth's main transportation option is the buses, the public cars. And so having limited access to that is also another level of complexity. So on the next slide, we just really want to focus on where we knew we had to focus our efforts. So when COVID hit, we knew that the objective had to support efforts for resilient youth as well as resilient businesses if the job market was going to have any chance to stand or to recover. So building on what we know, we used a market-driven approach to figure out a way to retool to show value add to the private sector in a time-sensitive manner, and to enhance their trust that youth can and should be considered for employment. So some key elements to achieve this are shown on the slide to the right. Essentially, being able to identify the new needs of the private sector during and after the shock. being able to demonstrate our ability to pivot to the job market needs in the new context. And not just our ability as a project, but also the youth's ability. And then it's so important to maintain or stay part of the conversation. So between our private sector and our public sector partners, we had to figure out how to stay relevant, how to ensure that we could provide them with some services in a time-sensitive manner, and to create this feedback loop into our youth engagement strategy. So everything that we were learning was getting somehow transferred into our youth engagement strategy. So to focus on a little bit about what we did with the private sector in that showing value add. On the next slide, you can see that we focused our efforts on the expansion and recovery of employment with those partners. That took 3 different major work streams, one being able to provide support, technical assistance in creating virtual biosafety courses, and also toolkits that would allow the businesses and the business associations to apply these measures in the workplace. To help the chambers and business associations support job recoveries, and this can take a lot of different forms. And of course, always improving on the public-private coordination for job recovery. We saw a lot of public services that were being available, not necessarily reaching the general public. And so that coordination was a key factor of the success. So just a few results to date related to that work specific to the biosafety and COVID pandemic. To date, we're on 10 different platforms. I mean, if you could just return back to that slide, excuse me. To date, we're on 10 different platforms that for the biosafety courses and toolkits that have helped up more than 6,000 businesses and have reached more than 260,000 individuals in country. As we move to the next slide, we can see how we not only focus on the private and public sector side of things, but also on the youth side of things. So with all the information that we were able to gain from maintaining that partnership and maintaining as part of the conversation, we knew what to expect and what services were available in the public space. So we took that, we adapted our youth services to be a little bit more holistic and COVID responsive. As you can see on the slide, that takes a lot of different forms, from focusing our efforts on increasing their emotional intelligence and resilience focus, as my colleague from Guatemala had just described the importance. Increasing our partnerships, our partnership networks for food, also personal protective equipment to keep our youth safe and secure if they were returning back to work and in their communities. It helped us identify new skill sets and skill gaps that we needed to really focus our efforts in providing those providing referral trainings or direct trainings with our youth. And that does include biosafety. And on that last one, we also were able to test different low-tech options on how to engage in a virtual space with our youth. Not all of our youth have access to internet data, and so we needed to figure out what low-tech options were available to make sure that they are getting the skills that they need in specifically biosafety protocols, but also additional skills in how they can learn a little bit more on computation, additional subject matters such as resilience. And so that has been a key to our success as we continue to adapt our strategies. It was also an opportunity to engage with the youth to help them understand what the realities of the job market were. I think that we're focusing on the well-being of the individual, but at the same time helping them understand, what has changed and how are you going to navigate this in this new context. So on the next slide, all of these adaptations were possible because we use a systematic labor coaching methodology. So essentially we have a team of coaches across the nation that have a specific number of individuals that are assigned to them. We've been using this methodology for approximately since year 2 of the project. And little by little, we refined the approach. And I think we saw a lot of the results from this approach in the COVID shock. Specifically, how important this personalized case management methodology that includes one-on-one conversations, targeted communications campaigns, not only on social media, but also through specific WhatsApp groups. So all of our kids, all of our youth have WhatsApp. Upon graduating, we created WhatsApp groups that were specific to the training groups. This allowed them to create connections among themselves and continue those connections. It also created a back and forth dialogue between our coaches and also the communication campaigns. And so that's been extremely successful. This has resulted in constant engagement with the youth. It is not simply, once a month we have some type of touch point with our youth. It's a constant. Every week we have new communication campaigns. Our coaches are able to follow up with the youth regarding the subject matter of that communication campaign, help them understand how it's relevant to them, guide them in any questions they might have, prepare them for interviews. Especially in this virtual space, it's a little bit different than what we had originally trained on. And so I think having that one-on-one connection has been a huge factor of success for us. And although we're not out of the COVID shock yet, in the initial stages, we are seeing the fruits to our labor. So we are seeing, as the economy is opening up, there are new job opportunities. And because we are able to maintain this strong relationship with the private sector, they are turning to us as a project as a resource for qualified candidates. So we look forward to seeing this continue to grow as the economy continues to open up more and more. And we are also looking at the next steps, how this strategy, this methodology can start to support some of the efforts in the Secretary of Education in Honduras, as well as the National Employment Service. We are going to be piloting a few programs with them in the next 10 months. And we're hoping that this is also going to be a methodology and a tool that's going to allow them to provide services to not only youth population, but also employment recovery on the whole as COVID continues to progress. So that is it. Thank you so much for your attention. Our information is on the slide. If you'd like to know more about the project, about our approach, be happy to engage with anybody that's in the audience, and you can reach us through social medias.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think that's a really great example of how adequately addressing shocks means supporting both youth beneficiaries and private sector partners. So thank you so much for that example and for explaining your work to us. Now, last, of course not least, we want to move on to Caterina, who's going to speak about her program in El Salvador, which is closing out. And as you'll see from the presentation, is really focusing on sustainability and institutionalization. So Caterina, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. I'm Caterina Valera, Chief of Party of USAID Bridges to Employment in El Salvador. It's also called Puentes. We wanted to share a bit about why we had a sharp jump. We tripled our job placement rates last year, despite the economic, security, and health challenges in the country. And we think that this was possible thanks to a strategy that was focused on expanding labor bridging work by strengthening training centers, educational institutions, so they could work directly on improving the employability of youth beneficiaries, providing directly wraparound services, offering job search support, and helping youth open opportunities with employers. Next slide, please. So this is the case study, the research center, how we institutionalize labor bridging that we will be sharing with you today. Next slide, please. It's called Se Orienta. But first, we'd like to introduce the project. Bridges to Employment is a USAID funded activity. It's implemented by DI Global in El Salvador from 2015 to 2020. So it ends next month in November. And the main goal has been to increase the employment of vulnerable youth in El Salvador, highest crime municipalities within the country's fastest growing economic sectors. So we have supported youth to continue also their studies, for example, formal education or professional vocational training, or become entrepreneurs. What we wanted is to link vulnerable youth with resources, training, and employment opportunities for them to have a better life. So we work with youth from 16 to 29 years old, and some data just we reach indirectly 15,000 beneficiaries, and directly 25,000 youth that received directly services from the project. About 10,000 youth went back to school, formal education or vocational training, and 4,708 vulnerable youth were placed in jobs and were hired by 1,247 different employers in 92 municipalities. Next slide, please. So it sounds great, but in order to give you a little bit of a background at what we found, the context is national unemployment rate was, as Lindsay said, was almost the same. It was around 7% on a national level, but youth unemployment was the double. And El Salvador produces an average of 30,000 jobs per year. So in order to absorb new entrants to the labor market, every year 40,000 jobs are needed. So placing vulnerable youth, and often very discriminated youth, in a labor market that was already in deficit entailed matching exactly job opportunities with youth skills. So in the beginning of the project, we conducted a labor market assessment, and we identified some issues that probably are also true for Guatemala and Honduras. So training courses offered to youth were outdated, not aligned with labor market needs. Employers did have a variety of job openings, but many positions were not filled by companies who said that they were unable to find qualified candidates. Companies mentioned that they needed employees, but not only technical skills, but also soft skills to perform well on the job. And they thought that youth often lack the combination of both technical and soft or life skills. But we get from the employers, that they had tons of security concerns. So companies were afraid of hiring youth from high crime municipalities because they were afraid that a person living in high risk areas could be involved or knew someone involved in criminal activities, or that they could have problems going back and forth home and crossing among high-risk areas dominated by a rival gang. So they were very rigorous companies in recruitment processes, which often require applicants to present criminal police records, medical records, or making it very difficult and costly for youth to meet their requirements. On the other hand, while many of the El Salvador vulnerable youth were willing to work, they not only lacked the knowledge or skills demanded by employers, as they said, but also they didn't have the tools or the necessary support to navigate the job search and application processes. So these processes are long, complex, as I mentioned, so youth often felt frustrated, simply drop out, turn to informal employment, or migrate. Next slide, please. So labor bridging activities include trying to connect youth with possible employers, as well as preparing them to perform well during interviews. So how to do labor bridging and placing vulnerable youth in jobs in an economy that was growing at 2.3%, in a market already in deficit, and with a disconnection of distrust between employers and potential employees, vulnerable youth, wasn't obvious to us. So in order to engage private sector and be able to place youth in jobs that were provided by the private sector, we had three objectives: creating an enabling environment to promote workforce development for vulnerable youth, institutional strengthening of training centers so they could provide better services to youth and improve youth workforce readiness. And all three were key in achieving labor bridging for youth. Because in order to train qualified youth with the skills needed in the workforce and boost youth employability, the objective 3 below in gray, the project had to strengthen the capacity of local training centers or civil society organizations so youth could be properly trained with an updated curriculum so they could gain the skills demanded by the labor market. So that's the strengthening institutions, objective 2 in blue below. We had to work with private and public sector to build an optimal enabling environment for youth workforce and support companies to improve their policies and practices so to be more inclusive. That's objective 1, you see up in red, in order to be able to place trained youth or graduates in jobs. Objective 3 in gray, youth workforce readiness. So all objectives, we had to work with the private sector. We had to work with them not only for the hiring practices, also to update curricula to be aligned with private sector needs, and also to offer internships opportunities and facilitate on the job training. So the private sector also helped build youth skills in that way. So all interventions we needed to engage private sector in order to facilitate labor bridging for youth. Next slide, please. So of course, to place youth in jobs, we needed to understand private sector needs, perspectives, so we could do the match, youth in jobs. We spent significant time building relationships with the private sector, meeting industry associations, meeting one-on-one representatives of individual companies to understand their needs. And once we gathered, even we had a tracker with 300 companies and the status of the relationship with them using traffic light, green, yellow, red, what we said, and USAID had access all the time to the tracker to know where we were with each of them. But once we gather all the myriad of needs, vacancies, internships, opportunities, sometimes they ask us to train their staff in life skills so they could have not new but improved employment. We decided to respond to individual needs, and we started sharing information with training centers and youth about job openings and internships opportunities. We started bringing training centers with us to meetings with private sector, encouraging training centers to sign MOU with private sector so they could establish a long-term relationship. Training centers met with companies. We were just the facilitators to align curricula. That happened with electricity and other textiles as well. So we also train and assist the training centers and individuals in navigating the job search and application process, in job readiness, participated and supported training centers in hosting job fairs, recruiting event, networking events, and train job placement managers. We asked training centers to hire job placement managers that could be the interface with the private sector long term. And those, we train them very often at the office so they could have the interface with companies. Next slide, please. But of course, all these skills that we wanted to leave beyond, we wanted to leave it beyond Puentes, El Salvador, because the project was closing out. And as they didn't have initially that capacity or the ability to provide this critical labor orientation, job readiness, job placement, support for youth, we had to work and shift the mindset of training centers for the training's sake and recognizing and accepting the critical role that they play in preparing youth to succeed in the workforce. And once we had already job placement manager within training centers and as part of the institutional strengthening component, with the USAID, we said it would be better just beyond the project, establish 7 permanent resource centers known as Se Orientas, or Centros de Orientación para el Trabajo. We established 7 in 4 locations, San Miguel, Santa Ana, Sonsacate, and San Salvador, to improve the institutional infrastructure and equipment within training centers. They work as one-stop shops. We're staffed with trained professionals, job placement managers, but also the rest of the staff within training centers, and we're provided with a library of resources. So youth had the reliable access to the support that they need, youth need to advance their professional and personal development. Next slide, please. So those Se Orienta, these Se Orienta provide a wide range of wraparound and labor orientation job search services and information to vulnerable youth and link youth to hiring companies. They provide personalized assistance. They meet with the individual needs, tailor-made, to provide career guidance, labor orientation, coaching on how to strengthen their competencies in hiring processes, information about available trainings, job search assistance, resources to help youth become entrepreneurs, tailored psychosocial assistance. And you'll see in that picture what we envisioned in the beginning of the project. Next, please. And this is how it turned out. This is a picture of a Se Orienta at the USAID grantee US in San Salvador and all the services they provide. The next slide, please. This is basically to show you a way in which the Se Orientas institutionalized labor intermediation services. These are the type of wraparound services available through Se Orientas: career guidance, job search, as I mentioned, support to entrepreneurs. And just to walk you through, so once interested youth connect to a Se Orienta, the staff is trained to welcome youth, identify the interest for Se Orienta services, articulate what the center has to offer, capture intake information accurately, help youth determining what next steps are appropriate for their interest and situation. And then the Se Orienta staff know how to provide the career guidance, recommending available options, like returning to the education system in flexible modalities or enrolling in vocational training, technical education, higher education, available scholarships. But if they select the path of job placement, the Se Orienta staff will support youth in strengthening their competencies to conduct an active and successful job search, how to prepare a proper CV, perform an interview, register for various online employment platforms, invite these youth to participate in job fairs, in workforce readiness sessions, job circuits, open doors with private sector so that improve their possibility to get a job. And if the youth say, I would like to be self-employed or be an entrepreneur, the Se Orienta staff will share information about a specialized support for entrepreneurs. Next slide, please. So this is just a route followed by the user with the Se Orienta, the interventions, and the outcome depending on the user's interest, as I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. But USAID Bridges to Employment work to create a number of resources. So these career counseling and mentoring services within the Se Orienta's offices could be institutionalized and carried forward one Puentes ended. So you'll see in the next one, psychosocial assistant toolkit, because we often found youth that were trying to get a job, but they had very difficult situations at home. And these toolkits are mostly referrals, explaining the situation for people with disabilities or migrants or the women, social exclusion, so they could be referred to understand the problem first and then referred to the institution that could deal with the problem properly. And then career orientation guides that shows all the paths, career paths, labor orientation videos with the specific tips for youth, and new life skills modules on self-control and critical thinking developed by the project because they weren't part of the life skills modules within the country. Next slide, please. and the life skills integration manual into technical training. We found that it would be interesting not only to, have a split life skills and technical training, but try to merge, and once technical training was stopped, include life skills within, embedded. A guide on how to engage with private sector for training centers so they could know how to deal with private sector. And as CONAMIPES, which is the entity here that works on entrepreneur, we updated and we developed some of the modules of research for entrepreneurs. And also several other tools, intake interview forms, sample format of a proper CV, guide for preparing a life plan, labor orientation guides, specific directories, so more than 70 resources for them. Next slide, please. And just to share, it is working. I mean, efforts have paid off since mid-July 2020 with the economy reopening in El Salvador, following months of stay-at-home orders due to COVID, as probably you have also encountered. Companies began contacting the Orientas for assistance in identifying qualified youth to meet their requirement, their specific hiring needs. So these past days, for example, this is ever, Orientas just placement assist in place 36 youth who had received technical and life skills training through the Operation and Industrial Apparel Machines course at Agape, and were hired, 27 of them in Fruit of the Loom and others. So youth are now very grateful because they are putting their skills to use for new employers and earning much needed income thanks to the assistance of the Orienta. Next slide, please. So very briefly, some of the achievement related to labor bridging, 56 firms improved their policies and practices to be more inclusive, more than 100 formal partnerships between training centers and private sector, 24 curricula certifications were updated with the support of the private sector, 29 training centers were strengthened to provide better services to youth, 27 training centers now included life skills permanently in their programming, and 4,708 vulnerable youth are now in jobs hired by 1,247 companies in 92 municipalities. Finally, next slide, please. Employers, because they have reached out to the Orientas asking for assistance during this shock, during this pandemic, the relationship between training centers and private sector have proven to be successful. They are now, without asking us, as in the beginning, they are now looking for support to fill their vacancies, and they specifically are asking for youth with technical and life skills. And we also think that life skills was key for youth that are now more resilient to shocks. And also having developed this entrepreneurship toolkits was also very handy at the end during these times in which there's not necessarily that many jobs available. Finally, last slide, one of the inherent challenges that project face is the goal of youth employment in the context where jobs are and internships are already limited. And we recommend that by strengthening the institutional capacity of training centers, by training staff of educational institutes and workforce development service providers on how to provide critical labor orientation and workforce readiness, by facilitating the relationship between training centers and private sector, I think we can ensure that increased number of vulnerable youth receive the support they need long term to be incorporated in the formal workforce. Thank you so much. This is what I wanted to share with you today. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Caterina. I think being able to put in place these permanent one-stop shops for labor bridging is really kind of a gold standard for workforce development. So it's very useful to hear about your experiences with that. I also want to direct everyone to the chat where the El Salvador Puentes program shared some very useful resources. So please feel free to look at those. And while you're in the chat, go ahead and type any questions that you might have. I know that all three projects employed many different strategies in dealing with helping youth find jobs in the context of many and varied shocks, particularly, of course, right now, COVID. And really want to thank the presenters for going into a deep dive with us on just one specific aspect of your approaches. We know workforce development is multifaceted, and a good workforce development program should benefit youth, of course, but also should benefit the private sector and training providers. And I think these presentations today really demonstrated how successfully adjusting a labor market bridging activities to shocks requires us to take action in all the facets of our programming. So from renewed focus on building critical soft skills, such as resilience, as we saw in Guatemala and also in Honduras, to understanding changing private sector needs in the face of shocks and responding by being ready to build new technical skills as well, as we saw in Honduras, and then to really institutionalizing labor bridging in a way that can withstand shocks and build the capacity of training providers, as well as serve both youth and businesses like we saw in El Salvador. So I think we have some great specific examples and a lot to think about. And I want to thank the three of you again for presenting today. Now I want to get into a little bit of a discussion. We have just a few minutes left. And I want to start with the couple of the Mentimeter responses that we got to our question about challenges other people have faced in helping youth find jobs. And I'd like to share them and pose them as a question to our panel because I think it's a really important subject, which is, one of the comments is saying many youth don't have a concept of career pathway. And so starting off at an entry-level job and learning new skills to prepare them for the next. So they get kind of frustrated or bored by the jobs that are currently available to them. And I think the question is, how do you work with labor market bridging and finding jobs that meet the skills and the aspirations of the youth? And I think that's a challenge all the time. And I assume it's particularly aggravated by shocks, such as, of course, COVID. So I wonder if the three of you would mind speaking a bit to that question for us. And I'll pass it to anyone who'd like to start.
I can start. I don't have I'm not sure I have a definitive answer, but I can echo the frustration because this is something that we have found a lot. The way that we have tackled this is really reinforcing with youth the fact that it is a pathway, and we've shared a lot of stories from our own staff and from well-known Guatemalans that we have recruited to the cause to talk about where we started and where we are now and how we got there. So reinforcing the message that it is a step-by-step process. Your first job is not going to be the job of your dreams, but every job along the way, everything you do along the way is going to contribute to building skills that you need to get where you want to go. So those are some of the ways that we have been addressing it.
I echo Sarah's comments. It's very difficult, and having tools in place or processes in place to ensure that the youth understand the realities of the market, I think, is a huge factor there. So the two tools that we use that allow us to help them visualize that pathway, one being the life plan, helping them identify, design their own life plan, understanding the steps along the way that need to be achieved to actually achieve that longer term goal. And then the other is vocational analysis. So this tool allows us to not only provide the youth with a very clear understanding of what are the skills needed in certain career paths, and what does that mean for education? What does that mean for your math skills versus your reading comprehension? And then helping them understand where they are in their evaluations, of their skill sets. And so I think figuring out how they can self-identify where they fit in that career path or in various career paths also help them kind of understand, okay, I have a passion for this, and I can do that in X career, and I know that I can do that because I have this skill set. And I think the video that the Guatemala team shared was a perfect example of that, of helping them self-identify what their strengths are.
I agree. I think what Sarah and Lindsay have said is, aligning vocational with a specific, their skills with a specific job is really key. But also, I would like just to add that sometimes employers describe the task inaccurately in the job description. So sometimes aligning the job description with a specific, so youth understand what they are getting into. We have, sometimes we have had the experience of a youth that goes, we place them in a job, and then once there, it is a night shift, and the employer of the job description didn't say that. So the youth spread the word that it had a bad experience, which discouraged other youth to apply to that company. So just saying aligning expectations is also a huge thing.
Yeah, thank you all so much for those answers. It is such a challenge, and I think really working with youth expectations, understanding their path, and also working with employers on how they describe and the words they use in the communication. It's just kind of all about bridging that gap, labor bridging, if you will. I didn't even think of that ahead of time. It worked out perfectly. We are out of time, unfortunately. I'm so sorry that Patricia did not get a chance to speak from Mathmatica. I do want to give a special thank you to Mathmatica, who just had a really big task in facilitating this learning agenda group, this community of practice, and got to know all the projects really well and did us a great service at USAID and for all of us who work in the field by really doing a deep dive into these programs, aggregating some of their results and explaining. We have the annual reports available, and we hope that you all take a look at those. I want to thank, of course, Lindsay, Sarah, and Katarina. Thank you all so much for the work you're doing and for presenting to us today. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for coming to listen, to share, and for all the work that you're also doing, the audience members, with workforce development and with disadvantaged youth. Everyone's work is important. We know a lot of people have a lot of experience in this, and that's why we love to take these opportunities to share and to communicate with each other and learn from each other. And that's what this community of practice and ultimately all of USAID's work is really about. So thank you all so much. Thank you, of course, Making Sense and Temi. And everyone have a great day. You have all the contact information on the slides, so feel free to reach out and check out the links in the chat as well. Thanks, everyone.